This is Ian MacKenzie here from the Mythic Masculine podcast. And this is a special edition episode where I'm going to be speaking with some representatives from the forthcoming Minnesota Men's Conference, which is an event, as I understand, was started by Robert Bly, author of course, Iron John, and known as one of the three-headed hydra of the mythopoetic men's movement, according to Martin Shaw. And this event I've been tracking for a number of years, but being in Minnesota and I'm on Vancouver Island, it was not in the cards for me to get there. But I saw that the 40th anniversary was upcoming, and I thought maybe this is the time to do it, to check into the pulse of the mythopoetic men scene 40 years on. And I am joined by two great men here to dive into this conversation. I'm going to read a little bit of a bio of each here. So one, welcome to Walton Stanley. Walton is writer, storyteller. He has held a lifelong interest in myth, story, and in the power of story to transform the paradigms in which we live. Welcome, Walton.
Thank you, Ian.
Also joined by Ben Dennis. Ben is a mythologist, a writer, but also a love of story, myth, psychology, psychodrama, and storytelling. His mythic interests include Greek mythology, Native American story, European fairy tale, and Hindu epic literature. Welcome, Ben. And so just to kick off this conversation, so this is really a 40-year on. It's a milestone for the Minnesota Men's Conference. And I'd love to hear from any of you just a little bit about how you came to this conference, what it means to you, and really what is this mysterious gathering that has been going on now for 4 decades?
Well, I'll start off because I was actually at the first conference in 1984. The way I came to it was through a small men's group, and one of the guys in the group brought in an article from New Age magazine. It was an interview with Robert Bly before he had written Iron John, but it was about the Iron John story. So he had been doing work on it, thinking about it, and he did an interview on that topic. And then he was speaking here in Minneapolis, telling the story. So I went to see him, and he passed a sheet around saying, anybody that's interested, let's do a conference here in Minnesota. And I signed my name, and the conference got kicked off. So
what was the first gathering? Again, was it a handful of guys? Was it a big group? Like, what was the initial stage?
I think it was somewhere around 40 to maybe about 60 guys. And it was at a camp in the near edge of the boundary waters of Minnesota. And Michael Mead was there. Robert was there. Terry Dobson, the Aikido master, was there. And Richard Close was an artist, a fine artist, was there. And they were kind of the leaders of that group, that conference.
Mm. Well, thank you. And Ben, and when did you come to this gathering?
I started I was familiar with the conference from the late 90s through one of my close friends, Daniel Deerdorf, who was a longtime participant, storyteller, and musician. Some of you have heard of him. And Danny and I had a pretty unique, close connection. And so I started learning about this idea. I've always been fascinated by literature and mythology and story, but I was never much of I had this incredible stage fright. So I never really put myself out there. Well, spending time with someone like Danny, who lived in a wheelchair, lived by virtue of his voice and his capacity to capture a room, encouraged me to open up my voice. So I started off the conference by escorting Danny and joining these 5 men. And then in the early, sometime after 2010, I started telling story, and been a close participant ever since. And what I can say on a deep heart level is that this was a place where I found that all of me could show up. And not many places in this society allow that, especially for men. The capacity to show up with all of your fears, your anxiety, your loves, your passions, your ability and willingness to shed tears, laughter, joy, anger, frustration, and do so in a way that was held by other men who were willing to hold that space. So through the course of the years, we've continued, and I don't think we've had, pandemic gave us one session where we did it online, but we've held true to the 40 years of being a gathering that chose to be together. Thank you, Ian, for joining us here, and I really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you, Ben. What would you say the initial intent was then in terms of, well, it seems to be story, right? You said Bly, of course, was working on an Iron John, and was that initially the fulcrum or the spoke to circle round through story at the center? Or what else called the men together to gather in this way?
Right. That story was told, and other stories were told by Michael Mead at that conference. It was definitely a major focus, but also Robert being a poet, poetry has always been huge in the conferences. And then we had, physical activities and with Terry Dobson, the Aikido master, arts, music was always kind of present because a lot of the guys who gravitated to the conference were musicians. And then also ritual took place, at least in some form, even at those earliest conferences. And as the years went by, we actually were blessed by the presence of ritual elders like Malagoma Somé and Martin Prechtel and some other men who infused the conference with a deeper sense of what ritual could be and what and how it would work, and how all those things kind of fed into each other. And the conference continues in that way. Story is always central, but also poetry, also ritual, also music, and things like that. So it's Robert Bly never really called it the mythopoetic conference. He always wanted a different word for it, and he tried to coin the expressive men's movement or conference.
Oh yeah.
So, but mythopoetic stuck. So
yeah. And what do you think? What was the tension there? And why did he feel like perhaps that maybe was too lofty, perhaps, or less, more esoteric?
Yeah, it might have been a little esoteric. It might have been a little inflationary. Yeah, something like that. And it's not the creation of myth. We weren't creating new myths. We were examining, extant myths or old myths as well. So it wasn't really a poesis in that sense.
Ben,
well, and I might interject too, that having some of those lofty names like that, there's a risk that you exclude people that don't feel like myself. I'm not a storyteller. I'm not a poet. I'm not any of those things. I'm some schmo that finds myself fascinated, but what would I be involved there? And of course, the invitation, once that was received and accepted, transformed my experience. And so to look at how we might call something like that, the mythopoetic, I find myself wrestling with the idea that what we really do is we're weavers, and we weave the stories, we weave the poetry, we weave rhetoric, we weave the interactions, we weave ritual, we weave the artistic expression, ceremony. We bring all these things together and we weave them. So it's, yes, we have schedule, and yes, we have an agenda and everything, but it's really stunning how organic we allow ourselves to truly become during the time that we're together.
I think the other thing then that it was, the men's work was always sort of labeled as a movement by the popular press or the cultural, and I don't think it ever was. It was always put as some kind of juxtaposition to the feminist movement, the men's movement, the women's movement. And of course, it was never really a movement. There were a lot of men moving, doing things, but I don't think it was ever a mass movement. I think it was especially with some of the indigenous teachers, they refer to themselves as reverse missionaries. So there was an element of a kind of return to an attempt to glimpse an indigenous way of thinking, of holding the world, holding the world as as a living being, as a living world. Of course, that was a big part of James Hillman's work as well, that the depth psychologist, or typo psychologist, James Hillman was a major teacher at the conference.
I love that. Reverse missionary. I mean, the other word that comes to mind, which maybe is more in use, is decolonization, perhaps, right? I see a similar sense of it, but I love that phrasing. I'm curious for you that Michael Mead, when I interviewed him a few years ago, and he did talk about the same thing. They called it a men's movement, but it's not accurate. He said it was soul work.
Yeah.
Right. It was men's soul work, and that was an important distinction, because at least what he said is, when men get together and move, it's usually, to war or something, whereas this was, had a different intent. And I'm curious for you, tracking, of course, over the last 4 decades since that time, I think 84, you said. What have you seen has been the ebbs and flows of, if maybe men's work broadly, but men's work in this vein? Because I also know, talking with Martin Shaw, he said that there was this kind of initial surge, right, of big interest. I've heard, men gathering in gyms all over the country. And, when Iron John first came out and King Moore, Magician Lover, it was, quite a scene. It seems to be. And then there was also this kind of quieting down. And Martin called it a bit of like soul work of the movement itself, or at least the people themselves into, where are the blind spots? Where's the, white centrism, or where's the heteronormativity, or what's the cultural appropriation, all these kind of things. Bill Koth, of course, with MKP, I had a very candid conversation with him as well, that he was like, yeah, you know what, we shamelessly ripped stuff off because we didn't know. But they are on them in that organization, the Mankind Project, is also going through their own process with this, right? So there's clear value in it. But I'm curious for you, like, how have you tracked the journey of the last 4 decades?
I would say that initially the conference was psychological in nature. It was coming out of Robert Bly's interest in Jungian psychology. Now, it was also it's also kind of a descendant of his Great Mother conferences, which have existed since the mid 1970s. So there were a lot of, I think, influences of that coming out of the 70s. It was a very much an artistic focused kind of thing. It was about creation and expression. And Robert Bly was, just an enormous personality and just a kind of a wild man in his own way. I think with the arrival of Malidoma Somé and Martine Prechtel, I think some of the focus moved into that kind of indigeneity, into a much more of a focus on ritual and preparation of ritual and being in reciprocal relationship with the world, with the cosmos. So that became a bit of the focus. Also, the early conferences, once they sort of got into the popular imagination, they were roundly mocked. There was a Scotch ad with a guy with his shirt stripped off and his tie wrapped around his head, pounding on a drum, and it said something like, you don't have to be a wild man to drink our Scotch or something, But there was a lot of mockery of men's work, and it was so. I think in some ways, certainly after the publication of Iron John, and that became a major bestseller, there were a lot of men that were attracted to that work, but then some of that attraction faded, and I think what's remained have been the men that have been kind of consistently kind of plowing that ground for over the years, and new men keep showing up out of various places too.
Mm-hmm. And Ben, what about your take on it?
Well, I just, something that occurred to me when Walton was talking is I think initially, and this is secondhand for me because I wasn't there for the first, 20 years, but there was a lot of real exuberance and expression, outward expression. And one thing that I've noticed over these last 10 years in particular is that there's been a real move towards bringing the circle in and allowing ourselves to be, I want to say be seen, but not in this demonstrative way that we see in today's culture, but really be seen inside. And so, for example, when we talk about ritual, one of the things that ends up happening is we pull ourselves into circle. I'm not going to go into the specifics, but when you're in circle and, you're tending to fire, you're tending to the elements, and you're really not out there trying to perform, you're choosing to allow yourself to step forward in a way that's both seen by the rest of the men that are in that circle, but by the world in a sense. And when you do that, then there's something that is moved inside. We're not seeking perfection. We're not looking for, find some better way to go out there and be a breadwinner or get the pretty girl or any of that kind of thing. What we're really striving for is some sense of place within ourselves and on the ground that we walk on. And I see that more and more finding itself home with us when we gather.
And I think Ben's right. And I think also there's an opposition between soul and ego. And so if you're doing soul work, then there is a closeness to the earth. There is a depth. There is kind of a cutting off of some of that ego work, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's part of it. I know at the end of every conference, and we still pretty much do this, we say, now, if this conference was absolutely transformational, peak experience, changed your life, rewired your whole being, maybe tell your best friend, but don't go giving away the gold. Don't go, blabbing to everybody. Well, that's the worst marketing strategy in the world. But but it's kind of true. So there is the idea of working on the soul, working on something that is going in the downward direction and going into the earth.
Yeah, they talk about the axis mundi, the world tree, in the Norse mythologies, the three great roots that go down into the pools that are underneath the world tree are deeper than can be possibly deep. They are truly, into the whole cosmos, into the universe. And the branches reach in the other direction in the same way. And one of the great imageries is, the serpent is in the roots, the deep earth connection, the thunderbirds in the branches, and in between is Ratatosk the squirrel carrying insults back and forth. And so that's where we are. We're in this place where we're dancing with these elements. And the great musician Doug Von Koss, who's been with us for many, many, many years, and I don't know if he's going to come again. He's done his time for sure. And he leads men in singing, some of the most amazing things. And what he does when he introduces the idea, he says, the first thing you need to know is that when we gather to sing, this is a perfection-free zone. And to go back to what Michael Meade was talking about, when men gather together, it tends to be to go to war, to be in competition, to do some kind of contending or battling or competition with each other. We get together to be perfection-free and to make music. And it might seem a little off-putting to somebody, but I can tell you, it's a pretty amazing experience.
Yeah. There's also a lot of what I call shoulder-to-shoulder intimacy with men. So, women always sort of talk about it. I've heard women sort of brag, like, we sit this close face-to-face for an hour and we share all our secrets. Yeah, well, when men are face-to-face, it's generally in opposition. It's generally it's the enemy. But men, I think, have intimacy that is shoulder to shoulder. So when men are out, even doing simple tasks, hauling firewood around and that kind of thing, that kind of intimacy exists in the conference in a kind of shoulder to shoulder.
Beautiful. And I see, as I look out as well on the cultural landscape in this moment, that there also is this deep hunger for what I might call mythic thinking, right, or mythological thinking or mythopoetic thinking, because we're sort of, capitalist modernity seems to have strip mined the vertical axis from beingness, and I think a lot of men, not just men, of course, but especially men, long to be part of a greater narrative. And there was a very striking moment, actually, in the I think it's called like the January 6th insurrection, or whatever it was a few years ago. I mean, I'm Canadian, so I just kind of watched from afar. But there was that fellow, they called him like the QAnon shaman, right? If you remember, he had the yak head or whatever, and painted face. But I read an article after that, and maybe you saw the same one, that said, I believe he was influenced by Iron John, as well as a few, lots of other places, alt-right, all that stuff. But I'm just using that as one example that there if you also take away the political dimension and you just see, here's a guy likely pretty, bored with his life, or just longing for a feeling of being part of something greater. And in the vacuum that is present for so many men, other forces, and often nefarious, can, go in and offer something, whether it's the Andrew Tates or, all that manosphere stuff too, right? And so I do think the idea that there's a need for a greater narrative or to be part of a greater cosmology, to me, that's like bedrock, right? It's like a human longing, especially it's a longing from men. And if a culture doesn't provide that, then there's a real cultural poverty there. And so I see so much of this longing and this kind of renaissance, right, around the mythopoetics is responding to that longing again, right? And especially at this time when, collapsed thinking. I mean, Bly might have even said, I think, this idea of the vertical axis collapse is like everything's literal and you can't actually make sense of much until you add the mythic dimension. And suddenly, now we can see, what's going on and where we might move next.
Well, I think that's right, Ian. And the, Iron John is about the loss of male initiation, really. That's the essence of the book. And the idea is that the old stories contain a kind of map or a guide to that initiatory process, which is in some ways alchemical and, and psychological as well. But what's part of initiation is coming to terms with mortality. It's coming to terms with death. It is going down, and it's negotiating. And in many initiatory stories, there's a negotiation with the lords of death, or you gamble with the lords of death and you always lose. And of course, we are going to lose. We are mortal. I mean, that's part of initiation. To me, the kind of machismo, the kind of the manosphere, as you talked about it, the kind of fascistic elements are attempts to make themselves invulnerable, right? Make themselves immortal. It comes out of a place of real fear. And so I think that's sort of the difference. And you can, once you sort of attack, I don't know if it's attack is the right word, but start questioning Western civilization, well, then all kinds of things can pop up, and some of them can be, if you're coming out of a place of fear, some of them can be pretty ugly.
Well, another thing to consider also is that we don't come together, and this isn't a vacuum. Especially, it's not a generational vacuum. We have elders and we have youngers, we have everybody in between. We have all manner of experience, everybody from physicians to truck drivers to, construction workers, everybody shows up. And in all societies in human existence, multiple generations were part of the landscape of the society that anybody lived in. In fact, if you didn't have a community, that was a death sentence. And so what to tag on to what Walton said about, having to contend with death, I mean, it's like you are in the direct presence of the generations, and know that you're, every old elder that passes on to the other side is one step closer that you're going to be there. And one of the really profound things that we have to contend with in this day and age, and I'm seeing all kinds of what we call toxic masculinity, the various toxicities that we see in this culture, is that the dearth of imagination has left us with this idea that you've got, an 80-year-old man who's showing off his muscles as though he was, Conan the Barbarian. That's not true. As we age, and then believe me, I'm feeling it now as I age. Yes, I certainly have a fair amount of vitality for somebody in my 60s. But boy, I tell you what, those aches and pains, they really remind me that I'm on a trajectory here. And my validity in life, my sense of identity, is tied to so much greater than what I can do physically. And we talked about ego, this idea that ego's in charge of things, not so much, especially as we get older. And so the experience of younger men who have the opportunity to sit at the knee of elder men who have the willingness to take the time and energy to see them, that's a kind of blessing that reaches past the armor that so many put on. I mean, we can go into the stories. I mean, there are copious numbers of stories where elders are the ones that guide the youngers through the trials and tribulations that they have to contend with. And what we hope to do here, what we intend on doing, is allowing that kind of mentoring relationship. It's actually a field where mentoring is allowed to occur. Nobody's assigned to anything. Nobody's given a list. But it's amazing to watch, shoulder to shoulder, to see some guy 70, 80, 90 years old standing there shoulder to shoulder with a 17-year-old. That's a kind of glow that you just don't see out there in the open culture today.
Yeah, I see lots of nodding from you, Walton. Yeah, anything you want to add to that?
Well, just that some of those relationships extend beyond the conference.
Oh, absolutely.
They're not assigned, but they happen organically, and I hear about it. An older man will say, "Well, so and so's been calling me, and here's the situation. Here's what he's gone through." But you have somebody to call.
Mm-hmm. And conversely, sometimes those older men are calling the younger men. That's a pretty astounding thing too, because there's not a recipe in that regard.
Right.
It strikes me then, and this is something else I feel like I've been tracking now about a decade now since I found Iron John and moved into this work, that really there's this, I might call it a regeneration of culture, right? Or the intelligence of village, right? That like you're saying, that, by engaging in ritual and coming together, like there's a natural intelligence that kicks in as both a blessing and a sort of wisdom transfer and a kind of nourishment, right? That is inherent through the willingness to gather. And the way that I've been somewhat mentored largely by a fellow named Stephen Jenkinson, you might know, around elderhood, is that he said, all of these are occasions to gather, but they're not at the center. Like that the center of ceremony is not human, right? The center of ceremony might be considered life itself. And then the way that we gather sort of clustered around that hearth inherently is life-giving by the willingness. And so I hear in what you're saying as well, like this is a hearth that's been tended now for decades. And the value and the gold that has come from that is countless, it seems.
Yeah. And I think to your point too, there's a lot of people, I think, approaching story in the way that Robert Bly and Michael Mead started doing back in the 80s, where I don't think very many people were working with story in that way. And now I think it's becoming more common among men and women, looking back to myth and story and actually working with it, and I think in a really healthy way.
Yeah, and it speaks to the imagination too. That you mentioned the contemporary digital world. I have to remember that everything digital still comes down to ones and zeros. We're still dealing with, granted, we've done amazing things, but we're still dealing with a manufactured reality. And so when we allow the imagination to have that truly organic flow, then we open up the door to profound experience, profound transformation. It's like I was just talking with a friend of mine who does a lot of social justice work, and she was saying that, the lack of imagination in what's happening in the world today may not be able to be avoided. But if we don't keep talking about it, if we don't keep inviting the transformation to occur, so that's just on one level. But on a deeper personal level, we still get to engage the imagination. We still get to tell the stories. We get to allow, that amazing cosmological display occur within us when we gather together like this.
Yes, and I think there's something to that about the idea of mediated consciousness. So, and by that I mean in engaging with some form of media. So one of the earliest media was the written word, right? That was a mediated form of consciousness. You could put a story into writing, and then that lasted for, it's still around, but it was the only mediation really for like 6,000 years. And then we started developing radio and film and things like that, and only very relatively recently, and now this, the internet and all that kind of thing. And now our consciousness is more and more and more mediated, where it's not our own, we're getting input, but we're not engaging our imagination in the same way. And when you light a fire and tell a story, and the sound of the storyteller's voice is rattling the bones in your ears, that's a much different form of engaging the imagination.
Yeah, I'm down in Buenos Aires right now, and I was just further south going on a whale watching trip here in Argentina. And one thing I noticed, and this is a real quick story, is I was watching the little kids when they were especially around the beach and around, on the whale watching boat and, even the restaurants. And I didn't see hardly any children with a screen in front of them, contrary to what we have here. And these kids are running around, making noise, touching everything, hitting each other, rolling all over the place. They were engaged. They were alive. And I could see the imaginations, just that little glowing spark, finding its way, like leaping across the way. It was beautiful.
I, for one, am looking forward to my time in just under a month at this stage now, beginning of October. I understand there's still spots available for men who feel called to gather. Yeah, if they head over to the website I'll include in the show notes for this conversation. And is there anything left to add, as an invitation to men who may feel called and stirred to join this gathering from either of you?
I would say just take the risks. We're not, we always say it at the beginning of the conference, we make a pledge that there will be no physical violence. And that was started by Etheridge Knight, the poet, who was, I think, one of a very few African-American men at that conference up in the North Woods of Wisconsin somewhere. And he said, I want it to be clear that there will be no physical violence. So we can argue, we can disagree, we can rattle each other's cages, but we always draw a line. So there is a safety. There's a container within the conference too. We very consciously build a container. So it is a place of safety, but it's also a place of joy. It's a place of grief. It's a place of expression. It's a place of ideas. So come.
Well, and I'll add something very simple. It's just if this is something that intrigues you, you are invited, and you will be welcome. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, thank you both for the time today. I'm wondering about this together and all the efforts that no doubt go into putting on a gathering once again, 40 years on. And I am looking forward to seeing you all willing in a few weeks in Minnesota.
Looking forward to
meeting you, Ian.
I'll have it in person, Ian.
Until then.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.